Bonsoir. I apologize for not being able to speak French. But what can I say? Dear Cyril Delon, Jacques Swallen, Christelle Fourlon-Coip, Patrice Menilia, and distinguished members of the audience. I really do not need to say this, but I have to say something which is the obvious, because sometimes the obvious is deeply personal. I am greatly honored by the award of this prize, and also very humbled by the generous reading that the jury had of this book. This book is indeed written as a collection of essays and developed as a series of essays. I did not know how to write this book. If there had not been the essay form, I would not have been able to write this book. It allowed me to repeat myself sometimes, to correct myself, to be speculative, to take risks. So I'm very honored that a prize that actually recognizes the essay as a form was also awarded to this book. And in that, I'm genuinely thrilled and grateful. I also have to, before I proceed, I also have to thank a few people whose friendships and whose thoughts were absolutely essential to the work I did, because when I first began to think about this problem of climate change, I was a historian of colonialism, of provincializing Europe. As Patrice was saying, I had no idea of climate change. In 2003, some fires in Australia got me interested, because a lot of not just humans but animals and everything, places I loved died, and I kept asking people, why were the fires so bad? And some friends said, climate change. And I said, very late in the history of the expression climate change, because the IPCC had been set up by the United Nations in 1988. So I was late by about 15 years in asking this question, what is climate change? And when I began to read about climate change, it blew away a lot of my assumptions as a historian. And one of the assumptions you make in writing history is that human history and natural history are separate. Even when Brodel was writing his longue durée histories, he was saying, nature is cyclical, it moves slowly, but humans change their societies quickly. Even without the Alps having gone, you can move from a pre-industrial society to an industrial society. And I made the same assumption, that yes, it's there, it's the background. And we're on a stage where this is the background, we are doing what we want to do. So when these things blew my mind, the only way I could write my thoughts down or up was in the form of theses. And I was very inspired, of course, by Walter Benjamin's thesis on history, Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, and this whole tradition of putting your words, your thought in this very cryptic short form. I published it, and most of my friends were angry that I was not simply blaming capitalism. I was saying, no, this is not so easily solved. And so going forward, I needed a lot of friends. I needed people to discuss things with me, give me courage and hope when people were criticizing, but I was also grateful to criticism. Because even when people disagree with you, you think about it, either you agree with them or you think harder to justify your position. So you end up clarifying your own thoughts. So I was very grateful to the criticisms, though they sometimes hurt, because sometimes critiques can be nasty. But in this process of the book could not have happened without conversations. I had no models. I was a humanist historian writing about this problem. And the only model, so I was late in coming to the problem. So the four questions that helped me were questions that the philosopher Patrice mentioned, Immanuel Kant, asked in his introduction to logic. So he said, when there's a very big problem, you ask three questions. What is the problem? And I realized that scientists had already defined the problem. Global warming was not something a historian could formulate, right? I could come from a society that believed in curses and I could say it's some black magic. But the idea that carbon dioxide or gases are doing something, heat trapping, that the scientists had explained. So what is the problem was answered. What can we do about it? Economists had already begun to answer that problem. Engineers and technologists had begun to answer this problem. Activists had answers from the problem. And my Marxist friends had a straight answer: get rid of capitalism. So what can we do about it? Answered. Different answers, but they were answers. Third question: what can I expect from it? And Kant says you can turn to religion to answer that question. And of course, if you think about the discussion of climate change, people sometimes accuse each other of apocalyptic thinking. Now that's a religious form of thinking, right? That is a Christian form of thinking, or Islam has its own version of apocalypse. In fact, between two of my friends, whom I was going to mention anyway, Bruno Latour and François Hartog. François Hartog wrote a very interesting book called Chronos. And the last chapter is about trying to say that Latour himself was technically an apocalyptic thinker, except a heretic one, because he assumed that humans could go beyond the apocalypse. To live beyond the apocalypse is what Latour was thinking about, and therefore François said, that's not a proper apocalyptic thinker, but he's an apocalyptic thinker in whom the Inquisition, if it still existed, would have an interest. So that was the Kant's answer to the third question, and today you realize it's not just religion, it's also art. From films to painting to photography. Sometimes you will come across books on the Anthropocene or climate change that actually show you the kind of ugliness of mining, for instance. When you look at it as landscape, mining just destroys landscapes. Sometimes towns that are coal mining towns are abandoned. So you go to art, and sometimes art will also inspire you to think another kind of future. Three big questions. What is the problem? What can we do about it? What do we expect? I was not in a position to answer, as Kant said. I'd come too late to the problem. But then Kant saved me by saying that all these three questions fold into a very large question, which in his own language, those days, he said, what is man? And really what he meant was, given the crisis, what is the human being today? And I thought maybe here I might have something to say. Coming late to the problem, not having a solution to it, interested in debating solutions, but as a citizen, not as a thinker. And the reason why I thought about it was because there had already been particularly German thinkers, but also French thinkers and other European thinkers. There's been a long tradition of thinking about the human condition without calling it by that name. But there was a book published in 1958 by Hannah Arendt, working in the tradition of German philosophy, called The Human Condition. It's only very recently I saw all the letters that passed between the University of Chicago Press that published the book and the referee for the manuscript. So I was doing a little book history and the letters from the referee to the press. And that's when I discovered, just last month, that the title that Hannah Arendt had for that book was Vita Activa. And Hans Morgenthau, this American political philosopher who read the book, said, for an American readers, this won't work. You have to call it the human condition. And it worked. And I realized that when Hannah Arendt was thinking about humanity as a whole, 1958, the first Soviet Sputnik was up. And she ends the book on a hopeful note. She said, well, at least now humans will be able to escape. So this is anticipating Elon Musk, long before Elon Musk, saying at least now humans will have to escape to another planet or somewhere else in space. And that's a big change in human condition. But she said something that Elon Musk would never probably even understand. She said there's a price to be paid for it, which is that we belong to this earth. And if we live on another planet, we will suffer what in English is, the language was earth alienation. And in a sense, the alienation from earth has already happened with climate change. We are becoming aware of it. But you see, to think this through, not as a trained philosopher who could have written a monograph, but somebody who is trained to be a humanist historian of imperialism, colonialism, of provincializing Europe, that kind of project. I didn't know how to proceed. So this 4 thesis essay was sent. 2 presses were interested in publishing it, Princeton and Chicago, and they both gave me the contract only on the basis of this essay. But one of the readers, I can now reveal it, for my press, was Bruno Latour. And Latour said, there's nothing new in what Chakrabarty is thinking. I mean, later on we became great friends, and I learned so much from him that even somebody as great as Latour probably saw these 4 theses and couldn't see a book in it. And the press went ahead and gave me the contract. Now, then the story begins of new friendships, new guidances, new advisors, new mentors, new teachers, without whom I would not have been able to think through this book, without whose help. And so I need to quickly thank them. So 3 French intellectuals were central to the thinking of this book. And one was Bruno Latour. And I miss him all the time. The second person was François Hartog, who wrote the preface for this book. But we've taught together a couple of times and we've had things to discuss together. Etienne Balibar, who was another teacher-like figure and who gave me a lot of encouragement when he first read the first 4 thesis essay. And then a geologist, Jan Zalasiewicz, a British-Polish geologist who read every line I read and who was interested in what humanities and humanists could contribute to the problem. My friend Patrice Manilier, whom I've known for a long time, but he is, as you would say in English, a friend, philosopher, and guide. It's through many of these debates. And the wonderful thing about Patrick is even when even when we disagree, he makes the disagreement itself productive. And that, I must say, that's a skill that most of my academic friends don't have. I mean, they stop talking to you if you disagree very strongly, or they think you're a very bad person, or they're very quick to think that you're morally inferior to them for not condemning something. And most of the time in the humanities and social sciences, at least in America, the position taken is, you are the problem, and I'm the solution. So the West is the problem, we in India is the solution, something like that. And I realized that that was not enough for what was going on. And of course, I have to thank Rochana, my partner in life and in all my crimes, and the controller of my mind and body or whatever. But Rochana has been through this entire journey, which has been wonderful. And then, of course, I make new friends through correspondence, Cyril, but I also have to thank Elise David, where I don't know where Elise is, but there you are, for all the warm and wonderful hospitality we've been enjoying. So that said, let me get back to the point about the essay and why this book. So one of the interesting things about the essay form is that it has become almost an anti-American tradition, if I can say so. Because most of my friends in America misunderstood what the prize was about. Patrice tells me that in French, the word essay now just means nonfiction, broadly. Whereas my American friends and some Indian friends thought this must be a 30-page article published in American Historical Review. And they wrote to me saying, please send us the essay. We want to read it. And this was a mistake of the same order that Queen Victoria made when she read Louis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And she said, oh, I love this book. I want to read all your books. Without realizing that most of his books were on algebra and maths. And of course, he chose to send her all the mathematical books about which he jokes in Alice in Wonderland and To the Looking Glass. But I realized that the American professionalization of academic disciplines has killed the spirit of the essay, the exploratory spirit of the essay that you were talking about, and made it into a kind of industrialized product and I literally say industrialized because no academic essay is complete without the author going to database to find other references. So without this industrial digital production of scholarship, and this probably goes back to what you were saying, Patrice, sometimes the enmity between knowledge and thinking. Right? You sometimes see this in American journals. I mean, it was very good. I had the good fortune recently to be on the advisory board of a foundation in America that was actually launching a global competition for an essay, but now meaning a short piece rather than nonfiction. And they said, oh, let's publish the best piece in a professional journal. And I had to remind them of the essay tradition. I said, that's killed the essay. Let's promote the essay genre. I mean, I was not aware then that I would get this prize. So the essay genre, it has different traditions in the French and English and German histories, but something that's very clear, and Adorno said it in defense of the essay, Lukács said it, that it allows for non-systematic, speculative, open-ended, experimental thinking. And I say experimental very advisedly because experimental thinking means you allow yourself the freedom to make mistakes and correct them. Whereas, in a published article, whether in physics or in history today, you can't take that freedom because the journal will be discredited if something erroneous is published. So in that sense, I was very, very pleased that the prize actually recognizes form, which I'll come back to in finishing what I have to say. So let me tell you about the connection that I see, the arc that I see connecting my previous work as a humanist historian, but questioning European categories, and this work, and why I think there's a connection, or the spirit of provincializing Europe in some ways runs through both books. So I became a historian having done undergraduate degree in physics, and my postgraduate was an MBA from Indian institution. I turned to history, mainly because I was interested in inequality, justice, oppression, and those sorts of questions. And the history of European domination interested me, and that was resulted eventually in the book in 2000, Provincializing Europe. Often people asked me, why didn't you provincialize America? Because America is the dominant power. Why talk about Europe? It's in decline. All it can think about is migration and refugees. So I said, but if you look at the last 500 years, and you think of the last 500 years as a play, a Shakespearean play, or maybe even a Greek play, the most expansive, interesting, contradictory character on that stage is Europe. On the one hand, it's expanding, it's colonizing, it's taking over other people's land, it's capturing people's bodies, their capacity to labor, to make slaves of them, it's destroying indigenous societies. On the other hand, it's also generating the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, critique of its own sins. A colleague of mine has a very interesting book on Diderot and his anti-imperial stance. And so it's like, as Europe does horrible things, thanks to Christianity and other influences, Europe also develops a conscience about it. And that conscience is what brings the essential message of modernity to many other societies. Because that conscience is the idea of freedom, is the idea of dignity, is the idea of ending exploitation. So the two late 19th, early 20th century variants are Marxism and liberalism, deeply European, but deeply, profoundly influential in other parts of the world, where people rebelled in the name of these. And so without Europe in India, Rochana was asking me yesterday, do you really like colonialism? I said, no. I think the messenger was horrible, but the message wasn't altogether bad. So she said, why? I said, because all that we could say through the inheritance of Islam about caste system, about treating people as untouchable, was that we're all equal in the eyes of God. We did not say we're all equal in the eyes of law. That came with Europeans. We did not say that the widows should not be burnt. It came with European thinking. We did not say that untouchability should be made illegal, and we have, but thanks to European thinking. But, so there was always this, so if you look at Europe, this contradictory character, it destroyed very many societies, mainly indigenous societies, whose land they took, where they had new settlements. So America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand are societies where indigenous societies were completely destroyed. But where they came, like India or later Malaysia, where already there were many people, they made us labor, but they did not do these things. Instead, they created universities. One of our 18th century Bengali intellectuals became a correspondent, and a friend of Bentham. And in these places, if you think of people like Gandhi or Tagore, the poet, in the 20th century, they were both deeply and profoundly interlocutors of Europe. And between the two wars, it's not accidental that they became famous between the two wars, when Europeans were deeply disappointed with themselves, particularly after the First World War. They turned to people like Tagore and Gandhi to think about what's wrong with our civilization that produces such barbarism. And Tagore once said a very interesting line he wrote, where he said, Europeans brought us some gifts, but these were not gifts they willingly gave us. These were gifts we had to wrest from their hands. So Europeans did not practice the idea of equality before the law. They had racism. They did not want non-white judges to try European people. Similarly, if you look at Gandhi in South Africa, he was such a believer in the principle of equality before law that every time he experiences racism, he goes to the court that the Europeans had set up, expecting justice. And that's why, but he didn't get it, he had to fight for it. So that's why Tagore said, Europe brought gifts, but we had to wrest them. They were not giving this to us. They were not charity. This was not charity. And one of the biggest gifts, I think, that we had to wrest from them and made them leave India was the idea of freedom. I mean, the idea of freedom doesn't make any sense without women's freedom, the low-caste person's freedom, the working class's freedom, but also freedom from colonial rule. So when we said to the British, go back to your own country, we were using a European idea of freedom. Sometimes they would say to us, but you only learned it from us. I said, yeah, but now that we've learned it, we're applying it. And you should be happy that we're applying what we've learned, so you go back. And so when I wrote Provincializing Europe, when I was a humanist historian, I was interested in the question of freedom. And freedom seemed like was the meaning of modernity. But when I became aware of climate change, I realized that most of our freedoms were based on fossil fuel consumption. So when you think of freedom to travel, freedom of expression, printing, reading books, publishing books. And what I realized as I did the work was that the notion of freedom, which we all love and enjoy, was so tied to fossil fuel consumption, which was contingent. So humans moved from using timber. So we lost timber. One of the reasons that a Chinese scholar was explaining to me that one of the reasons why you have stir-fried cooking with Chinese food, because they had used up their trees so much that they tried to conserve wood by cooking quickly. Ottomans had run out of timber. The British ran out of oak tree by the 18th century because oak was used to make warships. And oak had this property that the nails in the ship would not rust. So we moved to coal. Then through serendipity, you discover oil. It all looked like history of contingent developments, but it all left us with this sense of a necessity that our lives today are dependent on consumption of energy. And that is what development is about, what China wants. What India wants is more access to energy. And that's why all of these solutions take the form of saying, let's create renewable energy. But what we are trapped in, if you want to think of it as trapped, is this question of the fact that we can't live our lives, we can't have so many humans living well without the consumption of huge amounts of cheap and plentiful energy. And that's why we have to work out how to carry on with this life doing that. So in a sense, between Provincializing Europe and Climate Change book, the connection is you could ask, the connection is the question, what happened to freedom? So we're at a point where the freedoms are important. You don't have to give up on the idea of freedom. Our task is to think about collectively whether these freedoms can be reconfigured, thought about differently so that we have our freedoms, but we are not as dependent on such a huge consumption of energy. To give you just one example, and stop there. China, in 2 years, I think 2017 to 2019, something like that, produced and consumed as much cement as the United States had consumed over the 20th century. We used to, as human beings grow, they need more food in number. Some animals' lives become industrial. Bird life became industrial, so the most populous bird on the planet is broiler chicken, because we need it. The next most populous bird is an American bird, which is about 1.5 billion. Chicken is like 23 billion now. We have begun to industrialize. Fish used to be a wild catch for a long time. But now we mostly eat farmed fish. Most of the salmon I've had here is farmed salmon. And 90% of the world's fish supply now comes from Asia, most of it from China, the farmed fish. So people have calculated that if we don't use artificial fertilizer and pesticides, 40% of the human population would go without food. So we have created these challenges. So these people have to live. And to find this, how do we have the freedoms of development, the capacity to choose, the right to nutrition, the right to shelter, the right to education, but at the same time disentangle that from these huge models of consumption of energy is the challenge we face. And I don't have a solution to this, but what I was trying to do in the book is to try through the distinction between habitability and sustainability, trying to say, look, you have to understand the predicament that we want to live well. We can't do that if we cause loss of biodiversity, because we need other forms of life for us to live. And just last sentence is that, so you need insecticide, you need pesticide. Pesticides contribute to insecticide. So it comes back to a question again that Bruno Latour used to raise, and Patrice was reminded me, that goes back to Isabel Stenger's, that until now humanity has looked after itself, but in a way that has almost been an undeclared war on other forms of life. And we can't survive if we kill other forms of life. So what Bruno used to say, and Stengers too, is that we need to learn diplomacy. We need to learn to develop technology that is more fine-tuned, that does not eventually have the effect of a sledgehammer on biodiversity. Again, we have to go back to the people who are asking, what is the problem? What do we do about it? So this is not an anti-science position, because we have to work with scientists and technologists for them to understand the greater problem that we're all faced with, and for us to work with them so that more fine-tuned technologies can be developed, and science. And thank you very much for this, for being here. Thanks again to the Vellore Foundation for recognizing my work. And I just hope that the conversation we are having will continue with many different answers. Thank you. Thank you.